Good morning. Welcome to our February Utah Breakfast Club. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the founder of the Utah Breakfast Club, and I'm of counsel at the law firm of Kirton, McConkie. This is our second regular monthly event here in the state office building at the Capitol Complex. We'll meet every second Thursday at this time and get started right around 7:30-ish, 7:35. Thanks for your patience this morning. We have a great panel on our topic of finding solutions to the inversion and dealing with air quality, a big challenge for this part of Utah, indeed the whole state. But before I turn to our panel, I just want to make sure everyone's familiar with the purpose and concept of the Utah Breakfast Club. We're about highlighting the advantages, how to enhance and take advantage of those advantages in Utah, and also confronting the challenges. And last month we had a session on Hollywood on the Wasatch Front. Some of you attended. It was a very dynamic discussion about the digital media and technology industries here in Utah. And the recordings of our events are also available on utahbreakfast.com afterwards, so you can see a little bit about that. This month, we're tackling, again, a challenge that is very apparent. It hasn't been as bad to my eyes this year than last year, but it was a doozy last year, and maybe either Alan or Kerry has some statistics on the number of days of bad air we've had. But to start us off, this is a very clear problem that the state faces, and there's a couple of ways of going about it. And what we're going to be talking about today is what are the most cost-effective ways to do that? How can we find solutions to this problem? So let me go ahead and turn to our panel. We have first on the panel to your left is Shawn Teigen. Shawn is the research director at the Utah Foundation, and I should mention the Utah Foundation and Beehive Startups are sponsors of the Utah Breakfast Club, founding sponsors, and we're really grateful for their interest and support in what we're doing here. So we're grateful to have folks from the Utah Foundation here, and we're particularly grateful for Shawn because you were responsible for a report last year on this topic, and hopefully he'll be able to speak to that in just a moment. Shawn, as the research director, has worked on a range of policy issues from housing policy to healthcare issues, and has been involved in all aspects of Utah Foundation's wide-ranging work. To his left is Alan Matheson. Alan is the senior environmental advisor to Governor Gary Herbert, and has been in that role for more than 4 years. He's also worked as a state planning coordinator and oversees the Your Utah, Your Future statewide planning initiative. He comes from Envision, Utah, where he worked with a number of regional initiatives to help communities address the challenges of growth. And that's one of the themes that you'll find in other events of the Utah Breakfast Club. Please make sure to take a flyer which has all of those upcoming events. Challenges of growth sounds like a terrible problem to have, doesn't it? But it does create issues for our state, and we want to be able to deal with those in a cost-effective way. Then to his left is Kerry Kelly. Kerry is Associate Director of the Program for Air Quality, Health, and Society at the University of Utah, and is also the Vice Chair of the Air Quality Board, Utah State Air Quality Board. So we're going to look forward to hearing about the Air Quality Board's role in this, in finding solutions to this problem, and get some great perspectives that she brings to the subject. And then finally, to her left, we are really grateful that Lee Peacock from the Utah Petroleum Association has agreed to join us. UPA is a statewide trade association for the petroleum industries, and represent all aspects of oil and gas production, refining, and works again with local, state, and federal executives. Given the importance of the Tier 3 fuel standards, we'll certainly look forward to drilling into that here with Lee and with all of our panels and with each of you. So without much more delay, let's turn to Shawn. Shawn, last year you at the Utah Foundation published a really path-breaking report on air quality. I'm wondering if you could lay out a little bit behind the history of that and what the results you've seen since you put forward that study.
Yeah, that sounds great. So that report was a board report. Basically, our board of trustees said, hey, we'd like you to look at something regarding air quality. And mainly that report looked at what are the kind of aspects of air quality? Like what are the problems? Why is it that we have air quality issues here along the Wasatch Front and in Utah? And we looked at both the summertime ozone issues, and that's a result of a number of different things. We have a high altitude, and we have a lot of sun, and it gets really hot, and we get some ozone problems. We also looked at the wintertime issues with particulate matter in the air that kind of build up during periods of inversion, and we wanted to look at all the different kind of contributors to this, and the data we used are a little bit older now. There are some more recent data, but when you look at the air quality issue, particularly like if you look at wintertime ozone issues, and you try to determine where the particulate matter are coming from, you find that roughly half of those of that problem comes from vehicles and mobile sources, and about half comes from mobile sources. About around an eighth or something comes from point sources, which are the refiners and big industry, but also include large area sources like the University of Utah and BYU and whatnot. And then we look at, and area sources are around the other third or so, and those area sources are places like this building and your home and the place where you go to work. And so when you look at these things, we wanted to figure out, so what are the main contributors to each of those, and what can you do to really figure out how to reduce some of the bad air days, let's say. And we looked a little bit more. It's easier to think about this in terms of inversion and when you can see it as opposed to summertime smog and ozone issues. Because that's the thing that comes and goes, and it kind of comes with the heat and blows on out. But ozone is an issue that we get the inversion issues we get kind of stuck with, and we get some buildup of particulate matter. And so when we look at that, working on our own, we kind of figured, okay, so here are the main things that we could really do now and in the near term that have a huge effect. And one of the big things was based on research that Kerry Kelly had put together, and that is the wood smoke thing that is now becoming kind of a hot button issue in a lot of ways. But it's and we can talk about that a little bit more. But that is a really, really low hanging fruit, and that's something that if we wanted to, we could eliminate wood burning tomorrow, personally. But we could also implement some regulations, some rules and regulations that had some force behind them, and we would not have a wood burning issue. And whether that's 5% or a little bit more or a little bit less of the problem, that's a huge thing. That is if it's 5%, that is all of the refineries put together at Point of the Mountain. I mean, it's a big, huge deal. So it's something that you got to pay a lot of attention to. But the other thing, and you mentioned it, is this Tier 3 vehicles and fuel standards. And Tier 3 is something that's being implemented, and we can talk about that more as well. But that's a big deal, and that's going to have a large effect over the coming years. And interestingly, I think, is that I spoke with the new executive director at Envision Utah, and the work that your future had been kind of starting, and Robert Groh asked me, he said, what are the things that you're talking about? Like, what are you looking at in this report? And I said, well, this thing nobody's really talking about really too much, but it's wood burning, and maybe it's a little weird, and it sounds like it's a silly thing to be really focusing much effort on. And then there's this other thing called Tier 3, and it's kind of being implemented, or possibly going to be implemented, and it's a big deal. And he said, well, those are the exact two things that we're looking at. And they had a large group of people that were really focusing on this issue, and I mean those are two big ones. And And there are a lot of other things too, and we can talk about those as we go along. But ultimately, the result of the work on that project we released was that those two are two things that we should be kind of thinking about and contemplating and anticipating as we move along in the coming years.
One thing that caught my eye in your report was that cars and other forms of transportation account for 57% of particulate matter, 32% from homes and small businesses and local sources, and only 11% from major industrial sources. However, when you ask people what they think the problem is, the population incorrectly perceives 44% of the pollution problem from transportation, 39%, more than 3 times its actual amount from industry, and 17% from homes. So people underestimate the particulate matter from homes, overestimate from industry. What are the implications of that, Shawn, for kind of educating people about this problem?
Well, one of the reasons why I think this is the case is because when you look out, you look at your car and you see a little bit of stuff coming out of your car. But if you're driving into the valley and you see a big smokestack and there's something billowing out of the smokestack, you think obviously that is the problem. That's the problem, and you see the trail of what's coming out of that smokestack. But the implications of it are that then you think, well, maybe it's not just my problem. Maybe it's really somebody else's problem. If you're unaware exactly of where the pollution sources are, you think, well, so maybe it's some driving and maybe it's my thermostat, but let's let somebody else handle it, and I don't need to handle it myself. But I think that it is a community-wide issue. I mean, it is something that we as a community need to focus on in terms of industry and in terms of, as community players, industry, if they can utilize the best available technology for reducing their pollution, and if we can do things that personally that we can do to reduce our own part of the pollution in this mix, and if we can talk to our employers and say, maybe we don't need our thermostat at 74 in the summer and at 64 in the winter, or 74 in the winter and 64 in the summer. Maybe we can work on that and do some things, all of us, to reduce pollution. I think basically if you have a skewed outlook, then you can pass it on to somebody else, whereas this is an issue that we all, I think, need to really undertake.
Well, Alan, Matheson, one of the things that clearly emerges loud and clear is there's two biggie issues, right? There's the Tier 3 issue and there's the wood burning issue. At least that's the way it's kind of evolved. I'm wondering are those really equal problems, or is it more logical to try to go after one or the other in addressing air quality issues here in Utah?
Well, I think there's a danger in saying we've got these two biggies. The fact is, there isn't a silver bullet. We've got thousands of emission sources, and we've got to address all of them to make progress. I think maybe a little context before I answer that in detail. This has been an issue for a long time. I recently came across a history of Utah, and it had a little chapter on air quality and talked about the first regulation in 1890 in Salt Lake City regulating soft coal. And it talked about the first lawsuit was by farmers who had sued the smelters because the pollution was impacting their livestock, impacting their crops, et cetera. And a number of efforts by members of the community, mayors, the governor, and others to address air pollution in the early 1900s. It's been around for a long time. And we know that we've got the challenges of our topography and the weather. We've seen this winter, as compared to last winter, that we are, to some degree, subject to the weather patterns. Having said that, we've got a real issue. We all recognize we've got an issue with air quality. What we can control is the emissions. And we ought to be making every effort to reduce those emissions, and in fact are. I think sometimes we get bogged down in thinking about all the negative. But over the last 10 years, we've added 350,000 people to the Wasatch Front, and we've reduced our total emissions by 35%. So in 10 years, we've cut a third of the emissions. That's a trend that's continuing. We've got a state implementation plan in place that between now and 2019 is going to continue to ratchet down this pollution. It includes requiring the best available control technology, which is a term in the Clean Air Act, on all the major industrial sources. We've implemented 30 new regulations on the area sources that Shawn talked about. We've got education programs in place. So the trend lines are good. We also understand, though, that we're facing the headwinds of growth. We've got a lot of growth coming to the community. That means more driving. Projection of maybe a doubling of the vehicle miles traveled each day by 2050, 2060. So I think the solutions are going to be two things, and Shawn touched on them: technology and behavior. And there is a tendency, I think as Shawn said, to say we've got to do something about air quality, and those guys better start doing it. We've got to look in the mirror a little bit. That means industry's got to continue to do more. The area sources, our homes, our businesses have got to do more. Vehicles have got to do better. And you mentioned these two strategies that really are important. When we look at what we can do to improve air quality, we look at, one of the things you look at is the cost per ton reduced. And it just makes sense economically. We ought to be looking at those strategies that give us the biggest bang for the buck. We've seen with wood burning, there's certainly been a backlash. There are feelings about personal freedom. It's that sense of hearth and home, the comforts of home, memories of being out with grandfather cutting wood to bring in. Those things are not easy to overcome. But I think the process is working. The Air Quality Board has had hearings, learned a number of things from those hearings. There are areas in our non-attainment areas that don't have access to natural gas. Propane's very expensive, so there are some economic issues in there. Anyway, the board is looking at all of those issues and going to come up with a reasonable rule. With respect to Tier 3, not a silver bullet, but really a pretty big deal. Tier 3 is a rule that means we're going to have cleaner standard cars beginning with model year 2017 that'll roll in over time. The gasoline part of that is you'll have lower sulfur fuels that make the catalytic converters run better. And those two combined make a significant difference in the emissions from vehicles. Not easy to get there. Part of the challenge is that the refineries in Utah are all classified as small refineries. That means that the deadline for achieving the Tier 3 fuel is 2020. For large refineries, it's 2017. There's also a provision that allows the refineries to average over their fleet or potentially to buy credits from another refinery that has gone below the 10 parts per million standard. As a result, the refineries here don't necessarily have to meet the Tier 3 standards. So we've been, and I think another piece that's important to understand is that the state doesn't have authority to require it. We're precluded by federal law from requiring that to happen. So we've been working with the refineries, and they've been very good partners. They've spent $1 billion over the last 6 or 7 years on pollution control equipment and cleaner fuels. Because of the new standards that have been put in place, they're going to have to spend about that much more in the next few years. Tier 3 doesn't come cheap, but as the governor has sat down with each of the CEOs of the refineries and said, we've got a challenge here. one of the best things we can do is get those cleaner fuels along with the cleaner cars into our valley. And they've said, we recognize the problem. We live here, we've got families that live here. We want to be part of the solution. So they said all of them are looking very carefully at what it would take to get to Tier 3 here, doing the engineering analysis, the economic analysis, et cetera, and all said, we will do our best to get it here as soon as we can. So.
Alan, this is wonderful, and you've put so many issues on the table here. I want to go to the Tier 3. I'm sorry, Kerry, I'm going to skip over you and address this last issue Alan raised, which is really three things here. One is the 2017 versus 2020 deadline for small versus large, and the balancing or credits. Finally, the issue of authority and whether the state has authority to challenge this. Could you talk a little bit about what your members have addressed or promised to Governor Herbert in these discussions that have gone on?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The Tier 3 gasoline and vehicle program is an important step forward in a long line of improvements in fuels and vehicle technology. Ever since the implementation of the Clean Air Act, we as an industry have been working consistently towards cleaner fuels and have made tremendous strides. I think in the spirit of a little bit of context, it's important to realize that the Tier 3 program comes right on the heels of the full implementation of the Tier 2 vehicle and emissions and fuels program. The Tier 2 program brought us from 300 parts per million sulfur down to 30 parts per million sulfur. The Tier 3 program will take us even further from 30 parts per million down to 10. But it's not insignificant. In fact, it's very significant where we've come from, because when you talk about bang for buck in relation to reducing or cleaning fuels, the Tier 2 program has been exceptionally successful. And you see that in the fact that despite vehicle miles traveled going way, way up in the state, our emissions are trending downward as we've seen, and that's in part due to new technologies and cleaner fuels that are already in the marketplace. So now to the Tier 3 program. As Alan mentioned, the rule, EPA finalized the rule last spring, and companies, including those refiners here in Utah, are now in the technical analysis phase of trying to figure out what the best way to comply with the rule will be. As Alan mentioned, all of Utah's refiners fall within the small refinery classification. Just for a little bit of perspective, the 5 Utah refineries combined have a processing capability of about 168 or 170,000 barrels a day of crude oil. That's a lot of crude oil, but when you think about, for example, a Gulf Coast refinery, that a single refinery can process 500,000 barrels a day, it puts it in perspective that these truly are small refineries. They meet our needs here locally, but in a national scheme, we're exceptionally small. And that has implications as we implement this rule. EPA rightly envisioned the fact that there is a finite amount of resources available in the nation, that the engineering and construction expertise required to put in the required capital equipment that will be necessary to produce Tier 3 fuels. There's only a certain amount of that expertise nationwide, and rightfully so. The big refineries around the country are going to gobble up all of those resources first. And so small refiners like ours will have to wait our turn, unfortunately. EPA envisioned that, so they gave us an extension in time to implement the rule. As Alan mentioned, our companies have met with the governor, have talked about what makes sense for Utah. As an industry, we're very committed to air quality, as evidenced by our history and our investment in the state of Utah, both from an upstream perspective, the oil and gas producers, down through the refineries. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade in implementing clean air strategies, and more hundreds of millions in fuel technologies, and we'll continue those efforts into the future. I don't know if that answered the question.
Well, it's important to highlight thank you for the context from Tier 1 to Tier 2, and that's a big drop in particulate matter, and now we're going from Tier 2 to Tier 3. Is all of those benefits from Tier 3 from the combination of the catalytic converters and the fuel, or do you get some limited benefit even without the cars to burn the Tier 3 fuels?
Correct. It's a combination. Both technologies, the fuel technology and the vehicle technology, bring their own set of benefits. So either one without the other make improvements. Together they will work exceptionally well, and you'll see the greatest benefit with the two technologies together. I should note that one benefit locally that's good for all of us, in my view, is a lot of the sulfur issue has to do with the types of crude oil that are run in refineries. And as you know, the Salt Lake refineries run a great deal of Utah's own black wax crudes that are produced in the Uinta Basin. They have a lot of challenging characteristics with their highly paraffinic nature, but one of the real benefits to that black wax crude is it's exceptionally low in sulfur. So right now, Utah's refineries are substantially below the 30 parts per million sulfur level. They are allowed to have sulfur up to 30 parts per million, but because of the types of crudes that we run here, I think the average is substantially below that. So I think that's an important consideration when you think about the actual clean air benefits of the Tier 3 implementation. Is we may not see quite as much as anticipated because we're already substantially below the 30
what are
parts
we
per
averaging?
million. Those are proprietary numbers, refinery to refinery. I will say that we're probably in the low 20s on a statewide average. Some refineries are a little bit below that. Some refineries are a little bit higher than that, depending on the crudes they run.
So if we're at low 20s, we could be under the current rules at 30, and the Tier 3 will get you down to 10.
Correct.
What kind of investment do your refineries need to make? And are they going to make this by 2017 or 2020?
Good question. The removal of sulfur requires essentially a hydrotreating process. Involved in that, and one thing to keep in mind, it's an energy-intensive process. There's no free lunch here. This is going to mean higher expenses and higher emissions from refineries. That sulfur's got to go somewhere. So while the overall benefit to the community through the lower sulfur in the fuels is a great benefit, you have to realize that this is going to mean, at least to some extent, higher emissions from refineries. The Air Quality Board envisioned that in the latest PM 2.5 SIP and has given some allowance. But all of those new technologies and processes, including probably a new hydrogen plant in the Salt Lake Valley, because it's a hydrogen-intensive process. And there's probably not enough supply in the valley to meet those needs. So you have to have hydrogen. And then there will be new boilers and furnaces and combustion, which mean higher point source emissions. All of that has to be permitted through a major permit modification through the Air Quality Board. And as history has shown, that's not an insignificant process, and it takes a long time. So in a roundabout way, getting to your question, even if we started today with a commitment to producing Tier 3 fuels, it's a lengthy process to get there. That's why the 2020 deadline is important to us, because we think it's going to take pretty close to that long to get all the ducks lined up to actually produce Tier 3 fuels here.
Okay, so I'm hearing 2020 though, which is what the federal rules allow. Now, what about this balancing out? Could you talk about that? Because
Sure.
potentially that means you don't meet that by 2020.
EPA, again, rightfully understood the fact that larger companies with refineries in various parts of the country may want to or decide to make those significant capital investments where it makes the most environmental and economic sense. So a large refinery or a large refiner that has refineries in various parts of the country can put in the investment, say they average 8 parts per million at one of their 400,000 barrel a day refineries. That gives them more than enough credits below that 10 parts per million standard to allow for other smaller refineries, for example, in other parts of the country to be somewhat above the 10 parts per million. But when you average out the fleet-wide sulfur levels, they meet the standard. I'm not saying that that's what will happen here, but that is allowable under the Tier 3 regulation. Salt Lake's refineries are all in a little bit different boat. Some of the refineries fall under that category because they have refineries in other parts of the country. For example, the Big West refinery, this is their only facility. So their options are a little bit more limited. The rule does allow the purchase of credits. You can go out on the market and buy sulfur credits to get you below that standard. Those may or may not be available. That'll be a function of the marketplace. And my guess is they'll be exceptionally expensive. So companies right now are weighing, what do we do to comply with the rule as it's written? The commitment is that we will comply. The rule allows for options on how we do it.
I mean, what's ironic here is that you can easily see from a refinery perspective, those capital investments to bring you down make more sense in a Gulf refinery, but the 7 counties that would stand to benefit the most from Tier 3 fuels are all in northern and central Utah here. So there's a bit of an economic mismatch here.
And we recognize that, and so and we're sensitive to it. That's why there's a lot of discussion and debate going on about not only what makes sense from an economic standpoint, but what makes sense from a community standpoint. And again, this isn't the only thing we're doing to improve air quality. As was mentioned, the implementation of the PM 2.5 state implementation plan is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to implement. And we're right in the middle of that. Right. So this program isn't in a vacuum. We're doing a lot of other things that are really good for the community.
Now, Kerry, Kelly, has what you heard from Lee, is that discouraging or encouraging for you?
Well, I guess the jury's still out on that. I mean, I understand the complexities of this, but it would be great to see this move forward. And I actually have a question for Lee. And I had heard that some fraction of the fuel that's sold here in the Wasatch Front is from outside the state, somewhere around 30%. Is that right?
That is a complicated question. If you got a couple hours, the bottom line is we both import refined fuel into the state and we also export refined fuel. We supply most of the state of Idaho and clear up into Washington with fuel. We also export fuel to Cedar City and Las Vegas. We also import fuel from Wyoming. So kind of the measure I use is Utah's refineries manufacture enough fuel to cover Utah's needs, but that's not actually how it works. We import fuel, we export fuel.
So I guess that means it makes it even more challenging as the state is working with local refineries to try to get Tier 3 fuel, to figure out how that works when when there's fuel from other states involved.
Well, Kerry, back us up and tell us a little bit about the Air Quality Board.
Oh, certainly.
What it is, what its mandate is, and I understand it issues rules, it has been issuing, updating rules. Tell us a little bit about those and your efforts through those
Sure.
rulemaking.
We've been heavily involved in the state implementation plan, and I guess I'll tell you a couple things that the board doesn't do first.
Okay.
So the board does not issue permits, so that's, people often misunderstand that. We also don't do any enforcement. So if you're upset about something, call enforcement. Don't call an air quality board member.
Call Alan, not you.
Call Alan. Yeah, but if you do, and often in the winter, air quality board members get a lot of phone calls because people are concerned about air quality, and you're free to call your air quality board member. But so regarding the SIP, the
State Implementation Plan.
State Implementation Plan, numerous types of rules have been passed. I heard both Alan and Lee talked about best available control technologies, and that requires industry to implement the best available control technology, and that translates into into things that you'll see. So, for example, on the refineries, people often drive by and see flares. So the state implementation plan is requiring flare gas recovery, and so most of the flares that you currently see will go away. There's still some needed for safety reasons. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we'll see a visible difference, and there are a number of requirements on the larger point sources like lower NOx burners and changes in operation, practice of operation, and Kennecott's repowering one of their power plants from coal to natural gas. So there are a number of requirements that have changed for large industry. There's also been a big focus, and we're getting a lot of reduction from area sources. So area sources, as Shawn mentioned, is this large miscellaneous class of things like paints and coatings and dry cleaners and printing and graphics and home heating and wood burning, and there have been more than 20 rules passed that address everything from paints and coatings to hairspray. So if you happen to be somebody who needs to have a really high, firm mohawk, some of the products you used to, I know, Ellen, some of the products you used to be able to buy in Utah are no longer available, and I'm sorry. But they've been working on reformulating those, so hopefully the mohawk crowd will be able to keep their hair high.
So lots of little?
Lots of little rules, and so this also goes back to what Alan said, where there are some larger strategies that could help in the near term, but there are also a lot of smaller strategies that are going to be necessary over the next, probably foreseeable future, because population is going to continue to grow, and we need to look at everything like low NOx water heaters and improved mass transit, along with Tier 3 and wood burning and other strategies.
Let me ask maybe a more philosophical question. When you're going after a particular identified problem, is the best way to do it to ban it or to find some way to massage it, right? And by that, I'd love to get Alan's perspective on, did the governor expect the reaction to his November 1 to March 15th wood burning ban? Was that more than you expected? And what are you going to do to tweak that in the future? So actually, let's let Kerry go first and then Alan.
Okay, so if you ask me a philosophical question, I'll give you my philosophical answer. I think that we should base the policy on the best science we have. Okay, and then I'll tie that back to wood burning. So the best science we have about wood burning suggests that it's responsible for about 5% of the pollution during inversions. And, but that data came from 2007 to 2011. And in the meantime, the Division of Air Quality has passed some rules, and it allows the the Division of Air Quality to call no burn days based on forecast. And as a scientist, I think that strategy does make a lot of sense. And there hasn't been enough time to evaluate whether or not that's been very effective. I guess I will tell you from a completely unscientific standpoint, I used to smell wood burning quite a lot. I live in an older neighborhood on no burn days, and I smell that less frequently now. And so I think that some of the attention has had an effect. But I'm not sure we've got the data to say the current method isn't working and that we need to go further.
So just to be clear, you're saying that the current method, which is a day is declared no burn, how much advance notice do people have?
They usually try to do a 3-day forecast, but I think the announcement is you'll hear it in the morning, it's
For
a
the
day.
day.
And they'll
It's a
typically-
no-burn day.
And they'll even tell you, I mean, once an inversion sets up, and I think the other thing to remember here is once an inversion sets up, everything that we emit into our valley stays in our valley. So I think a forecasting strategy does make a certain amount of sense.
Okay, so that's the current policy. Alan, tell us why the current policy was not working, or you wanted to change the current policy.
Well, I think one of the things that we've learned through these hearings is that there were a lot of people that had no idea that there were no burn days. And there's been a lot of noncompliance. And we continue to see on the filters, even during days called no burn days, that there's a lot of wood smoke. And it's particularly noxious. Poses significant health threats. So you kind of look at it in two frames of reference. One is the bigger air quality in the valley issue, meeting the federal standards. And as has been said, it's roughly 5%. Some have said that that's about double the pollution generated by the airport, including all the planes, everything else. So it's not a small matter. The other is those localized impacts. We're told that about 70% of the smoke that is generated in a fireplace ends up in the home where it's generated and in the neighbors' homes. And we've kind of taken a position as a society that we don't allow smoking in public places because it involuntarily exposes people to health hazards. Philosophically, the argument about wood is the same. Now, having said that, we do understand that there are people that, for legitimate economic reasons, burn wood. There's other reasons that they do. The governor would want me to be clear. He didn't propose November 1 to March 15th. That wasn't his proposal, but he did ask the Air Quality Board to look at a ban and what would be involved in that. And that's part of the process. You have a proposal, you educate people about it, you get input on it, and you refine the rule and go forward. And that's what's happening at this point. I think we're going to have a rule that is balanced, that helps advance the cause of air quality, but recognizes some of these other issues. One of the issues that's come out is these EPA certified stoves. Mm-hmm. And that's a standard that's changing. There are enforcement challenges there, but they do reduce the direct particulates, the unburned particles, the soot. What they don't reduce is the gases. And in our unique chemistry in our valley, a majority of the particulate emissions are formed by gases reacting in the atmosphere and forming small aerosol particulates. So those EPA certified stoves don't address that issue very well. But that's something we've got to look at.
Are we going to see a air quality board certified stove?
Actually, could I jump in one
Please.
thing on the stoves? I think another reason that the stoves have been, and wood burning has been something that's been a target, and a lot of people don't realize this, and sometimes don't want to know this, it's that if you heat your home with a fireplace, you emit about 2,000 times more fine particulate matter than if you heated your home with natural gas. If you heat with and now if you heat with an EPA certified wood stove, you emit a lot less fine particulate matter. However, you still emit about 150 times more particulate matter than heating your home with wood. So you could imagine
natural gas.
Sorry, than heating with natural gas. But you could imagine there's a balance here. You want to reduce the emissions per stove. That's a good strategy. Mm-hmm. But the problem is if you reduce the emissions per stove and now you let more people burn, you've got sort of this balancing act, and enforcement gets to be a challenge,
right,
as Alan had mentioned. So I think the whole thing is kind of a challenging issue.
Well, it sounds almost like the tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3. 2,000, 150 is a lot better than 2,000, but it's 150 is a lot worse than 1, or what's the comparative number for natural gas?
Well, it's 150 to
150 to 1
per unit energy basis.
Okay.
And so I think that's also where you have to remember, okay, so you look at the emissions per unit energy, and then you also look at the fact that once an inversion sets up, everything we emit into our valley stays in our valley. So I think that those are two important things to keep in mind as you're looking at
It's like driving around in a big garage, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You want to say something, Alan, before
Yeah,
we go to
just-
questions here?
I'm sorry, just quickly. You know, part of the role of government is balancing individual liberties and collective welfare. And this is kind of an example of that, trying to find what that appropriate balance is. And as over time, as we've been trying to address air quality challenges, there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit left. And any of the strategies that are on the table are going to affect people more and more. And so finding that balance is difficult. And what we find is that those who are most impacted by a proposal say, wait, our piece is small, go after something else. And they come up to the legislature, et cetera. So we're going to continue to see some of that dynamic, and I think we all have to recognize that if we're serious about air quality, we're all going to have a little skin in the game, and it's going to take some sacrifices.
Great, well, let's go to our first questioner.
Yeah, Mr. Peacock, in 1975, I worked with your father, who represented the Petroleum Association. That was 40 years ago. How much money has been donated to our research universities by any of your members to do research on these questions?
You know, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. Kerry, you might know if there's any current money.
I know that the university received a $10,000 gift from Holly. Chemical engineering did, but to look at some air quality issues. But I'm not aware of anything on a broader basis.
Pat, I don't know the answer to that. Anecdotally, the industry nationwide puts a lot of money into research and development and trying to develop new technologies to be better at what we do. Locally, that's something I'd have to try and research. That's a good question.
But the problem is that that's all proprietary and it's not in the free market where the best ideas and best research are coming out. And you ought to consider urging your members to make a few more donations as federal funds come down.
And I guess I'll add that the donation that went to chemical engineering was a gift. And so a gift has no strings attached to it and no publication limitations. So,
Good. Other questions from our audience here? While we're waiting for people to think of those questions, let me ask about how the debate here in Utah over our inversions and the air quality ties into the national debate we're seeing over issues of pollution, including carbon gases and greenhouse effect. Does anyone sort of kind of care to talk about the intersection of these issues? Are there similarities or uniqueness to the particular matters we're dealing with here? Shawn, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, one way I think they tie well together, when we talk about area sources, the like building standards in the state. I believe that our building codes are up to like 2012 code standards, but there's some language that that makes our building standards not quite that updated. They're more like 2006 standards. There's some caveats to the way we've accepted those 2012 standards, and so the thing about building codes is that when you build something, if you build a house to a certain standard, that house is going to be there for 100 years or whatever. If you put in a retail structure, it kind of depends. Maybe that's going to be around for 25 years, and if you build a large building, that's going to be around for a long time. So those kinds of things can assist in lowering some of the area source emissions, but they also have a huge benefit to greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think there's a lot of, these are tied together pretty well. Ultimately though, for the most part, except maybe not as much our ozone, which we create effectively some ozone during the summer and then that blows over to, we send some of that to Colorado and westward. But for the most part, this is a local, when you talk about particularly winter inversion issues, it's a very local problem where the greenhouse gas issue is a much larger issue. But I think a lot of these things are tied together. Like you could talk about, I think interestingly, when Alan talks about soft coal in 1890, I mean that is like coal people talk about wood burning, and wood burning is, it's a natural thing, and I go up and cut down a tree, and I take that, and I dry it out, and I burn that in my fireplace, and it's like a natural thing, but ultimately that soft coal was a natural thing, and it may be natural in many ways, but it's ultimately, you're releasing a lot of PM 2.5 into the atmosphere, but you're also releasing a lot of, you're creating a lot of greenhouse gases if it's not as efficient as it could be, as efficient as other types of home heating. It's not always home heating. A lot of times, a lot of these wood fires are from people. It's an enjoyable thing. It can be an enjoyable thing. But at the same time, you're releasing a lot of those greenhouse gases that you wouldn't necessarily need to release.
Lee, go ahead.
Just interesting to note, kind of to your question of different pollutants. For the first time, I know that right now in this legislative session, the Division of Air Quality is working on a bill. Historically, major sources pay an air operating permit fee on criteria pollutant emissions. The bill that's being worked on, to my knowledge for the first time, would differentiate between pollutants, would recognize that different pollutants have different characteristics and thus are more or less difficult to regulate. What it allows is for higher emission fees to be put on hazardous air pollutants. It also opens the door for the first time for the fee to be assessed against greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that to their credit, the state's realizing that this is a complex issue and they're trying to find mechanisms to work on different pollutants.
Alan, did you want to comment?
Well, just quickly, one piece of that. We are learning more and more that the chemistry in our valley are different from almost any other place in the country. So the regulations under the Clean Air Act are based on research that's been done in other parts of the country and don't always apply as well here. I mentioned that most of our particulate pollution is not emitted directly as particulates. It's the product of a chemical reaction. So in order to address the challenge, we need to understand the challenge. Last year, the legislature appropriated some money for research, and that went out through a competitive process to universities here and elsewhere to study some of our unique challenges. There's an appropriation request before the legislature right now asking for another $750,000 for research. So again, we can better define the problem and make sure that we're targeting our limited resources to those places where it can do the most good.
Is any of that research back in yet, Alan, from last year?
Do you know the answer to that? I think we've got some preliminary results.
Yeah,
but
I think there's some of the ozone chemistry is back in. So I don't know. Well, we didn't talk about this much today, but during the wintertime, the Uinta Basin has challenges with ozone, and it's kind of an unusual situation. There are not very many places in the country that experience these wintertime ozone problems. It's typically a summer ozone problem, and there were some funds that were given to some people to better understand some of the kinetics that would feed into these models. And I think that is in. But I think most of them have just really started.
Let's talk a little bit more about this point that Alan's made that I think is worth repeating, which is that there is so many unique factors to the chemistry, the fact that the 7 counties that stand to benefit the most from Tier 3 are here in Utah. What does that say about a bill like SB 87 by Senator Davis that would repeal a law that prevents the State Air Quality Board from passing pollution rules more stringent than the federal government requires? Could you speak to that legislation and the point generally about maybe we need something different from what the federal rules are prescribing?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The governor has been pretty open in saying that he thinks that Utah ought to be able to come up with the solutions that make sense here and not constrain ourselves in the options that are available to us. Now, he hasn't endorsed any particular bill, and I think there are a couple of bills before the legislature right now. Representative Edwards has one as well. And I know that's kind of been negotiated with a range of the stakeholder groups, but as a matter of principle, We don't think we ought to tie our hands. We ought to be able to get the best information from Utah and come up with the solutions that work best here.
Would that include Utah rules that are tougher, more strict than the federal government's? I mean, California does this all the time, passes laws for emissions by cars that are greater, and because of the size of the market, automakers adapt to that. Is that a feasible option for the state? Anyone? Alan, or others?
I'd say, yeah, it's got to be on the table. We ought to be able to look at what is causing our pollution and intervene where we can, and it makes sense. And I'm not saying we're going to adopt the California code here, because they've got, again, different causes of the problem to some extent. But we certainly ought to be looking at the best ideas and determining collectively what makes sense here.
Kerry, has this been an issue for the Air Quality Board? Have you wanted to issue rules, but you felt you can't because of federal?
Well, I guess there's one sort of a little bit of a workaround there, where you actually are allowed in the state implementation plan process to pick some of the best ideas from all over the country and implement rules. So many of the rules on paints and coatings came from other areas of the country that have air quality problems. And so those have been adopted, and they're stricter than the sort of general federal average standard. So some of those are allowed in the SIP, but now that that SIP process is done, I think it's important that the Air Quality Board have a lot of tools at their disposal, especially as new research comes in and highlights potentially more cost-effective ways to deal with the problem. I think it would be a good tool to have.
Lee, has the Utah Petroleum Association taken a position on this issue in particular?
We've been very involved in the process. Our position is that the statute has had merit and has been an important part of our air quality and environmental regulation for a lot of years. Our experience shows that the Air Quality Board has been able to make rules more stringent than the corresponding federal rule by going through the process that's described in the current statute. I have right here a list of just a number of things that our folks off the top of their heads a couple of days ago came up with that they are or will be complying with over the next few years through the PM 2.5 SIP that are significantly more stringent.
Let's hear those.
Well, the flare gas recovery rule that has been referenced, semi-annual tank inspections, the LDAR program, the opacity limits, 20% with no exception, the annual stack testing rules, the tank degassing rules, and that's just the beginning. So I guess our argument is that whatever the Air Quality Board does needs to be based on science instead of politics or public opinion. And in our opinion, some statutory provision protecting or moving us in that direction is of value. So we've been working with the sponsors of both bills. We strongly prefer Representative Edwards' approach, which kind of changes the optics of the current statute, and instead of being a negative, it's a positive to say that the state can have rules more stringent if they go through the prescribed process.
Kerry, could you just speak to how, is there a feasible way that the Air Quality Board, through this process we've been talking about, could, I mean, again, I appreciate, Lee, you've mentioned your refineries are going to abide by the rules, but if the Air Quality Board were to decide it wanted to require them to do it sooner than the federal rules, could you do that? What would be impediments to doing that?
Well, I guess, first of all, whenever I've seen these processes work and work well, it's important to work with the stakeholders, so I don't think it would be very effective to come up with a rule in the absence of good discussions with the stakeholders. And then there are, as Alan had mentioned, there are other challenges with the Tier 3 and some of the federal rules. So I think that I can't speak for the entire board, but those are waters that I think the board members would be very nervous about treading into.
We continue to be open to questions. I see one here. Let's go ahead and.
Two things I haven't heard mentioned. One, economic impact. Has anybody looked at sort of like the gross dollar amount of what things like that, or what have you. And the second one, examples of places that have done air quality remediation well. You hear about Mexico cities of the world that have done a good job. Is there a model that Utah looks to that any of you have touched on?
Great questions.
You know, so nobody's really done that work in terms of quantifying those economic numbers, but I think interestingly, and this is my own opinion, but I think it bears up pretty well. I think one of the reasons why the legislature and the governor have been talking about this issue in many ways are because of groups like the Chamber of Commerce, the Salt Lake Chamber, who have been talking about this and framing this issue in an economic development kind of light, and talking about the, you know, you come here for Sundance and we're socked in with inversion and kind of the brown cloud when they come in from Park City and whatnot, and I think that in many ways it's great, and you know, if we're talking about it because of those economic development reasons, I think that's fantastic. I think that in some ways maybe we need to now move. You know, Alan mentioned that a lot of people don't even know about red air and green air days, and you know, you're going to burn a fire whenever you're going to burn a fire. I think that the University of Utah and other groups are trying to figure out, like, here are some of the health effects of this stuff, particularly for this area, and they're specific in some ways to this area because of the short-term kind of intense pollution issues. But I think that if we're going to make a change personally on an individual level, we have to know about the fact that when you're lighting a fire in your fireplace, you're effectively smoking cigarettes in your house and your neighbors' homes. And what is the downside of that? It's not just, it's not that asthma is not a big deal, but it's not only asthma. It's not only your lungs. It's the fact that you've got higher incidence of vascular issues. I mean, there are a lot of other issues beyond the economic development side. But anecdotally, people talk about, like the Governor's Office of Economic Development will say, you know, we don't bring people in during January and maybe the first couple weeks in February because there's a risk that we're going to be socked in and people aren't going to want to move here. But and it's not just the companies, but it's also, you know, companies are concerned that maybe they can't bring the personnel that they want to work in their organizations, because you get on the front page of the New York Times or whatever, and it says, look, this is Salt Lake City, and can you imagine how bad this is? And it must be horrible to live there because they've got bad air. And then there's this year, and it's like, well, it's fantastic. You know, it's kind of complicated, but snow is a big issue. If there's snow on the ground, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to get this inversion kind of setting in. And this year's just been it's been a fantastic year, and we haven't had that bad publicity, but.
Kerry, let Alan respond here in a moment, but Kerry, does the Air Quality Board try to get statistics on some of the health impacts?
No, but that would be really useful, because as you're making decisions, oftentimes you'll hear, okay, this is how much it's going to cost in dollars per ton to reduce whatever. But there isn't a corresponding, this is what it costs us in terms of lost work days and hospitalizations and ER visits and
lack of businesses wanting to.
Exactly. And I think at this point we only have anecdotal information. I know there was a researcher from NYU who is interested in looking at this, and he's going to visit the university in March and hopefully talk about what he's doing, but I'm not sure if he's been able to collect enough data to get useful results for our valley yet. Okay. But hopefully we'll learn a little bit of something soon.
Okay, Alan, you wanted to add something to this?
Well, just quickly, I fully agree. We've talked a lot about how useful it would be to have a real cost-benefit analysis on all of this, but getting those numbers is really difficult. I mean, how do you quantify that some business owner in the East was thinking about different places to locate and read an article and decided to cross Utah off the list? You just can't capture some of those things. Right. So anyway, great information.
That one's harder, but what about health effects?
Yeah, health effects I think we've got to look at, and so we all recognize that information would be important. In terms of other models, we do look all over the world at what's being done and try to find things that make sense here. Looked at Mexico City. There are some interesting things being done there, but you know, they closed a refinery, but it was because it's a national refinery and the federal government paid for it. They tried to implement those standards where on odd days only odd license plates could go in, on even days only even license plate cars could go in. They found that people went out and bought 2 cars, one with an odd license plate and one with an even license plate, so they could go. So, and we've also found that our air is a lot cleaner than Mexico City's is, and they've got different chemistry, et cetera. So we do look far and wide at good ideas. The Air Quality Board, DEQ, have looked at hundreds of strategies. The Clean Air Action Team that the governor put together to look at strategies looked at well over 100 and evaluated them, including borrowing from other places and trying to find those that give us the biggest bang for the buck here.
Good. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions, if anyone else. Yes?
We talk a lot about what
Could you just,
the issues are.
let's try to speak in the microphone, and if you could say your name.
Marianne Martindale, Alliance for a Better Utah. We talk a lot about what the issues are. I mean, I think we're all pretty understanding of what those are, and certainly people here are probably pretty knowledgeable about no burn days. But we know the public doesn't have a clue about this stuff. I mean, the wood burning, the outcry that people had over that was just, you know, way over the top, and I think more than anybody expected. We posted something on healthcare yesterday, and had a guy go off on the fascist Gary Herbert that was trying to take his stove. You know, I mean, just completely not, you know, this cognitive dissonance about this. So what's the real tactical approach for educating people? Because we know we need to do it, but that's going to take money. It's going to take groups to actually do collaborative public awareness campaigns. I mean, what are we really doing, and how are we doing it now? Because we can't just talk about the fact that we need to do it. We need to appropriate money for it. We need to actually put campaigns together. We need to do it, or we're never going to get anywhere with people.
You know, just in some ways, I think having the governor step forward and bring this up and getting the backlash from the community is one of those ways. Like I mentioned before, like there are talking about communities that have done certain things. The Tacoma and Pierce County in Washington, and I think this, I'm a little fuzzy on all the details on this, but basically, if we followed something like what they've done, where you say, you know, we're going to fine you $1,000 if you light a fire, even if it's just a nice little fire on Christmas Eve, we're going to come and knock on your door on Christmas Eve and say, here you go, this is a $1,000 ticket for you. You can go through some boring 6-hour lesson where you kind of learn about the negative effects of this, and this is the reason why you shouldn't be doing it, and so you won't end up paying that $1,000 on the first ticket. But if you do something, if you implement something that is so radical like that, you will get the media. Like people will talk about it, and people will learn about, you know, the green and red air days and kind of figure that stuff out. Or if you do something, you know, in some ways it's banning the use of wood burning, and I've brought wood burning stoves a whole bunch of times, but just by doing it over a period like that, and saying, you know, you don't have to worry about red and green air days or any of that, because you can't have fires in the winter during the bad, you know, the potentially bad periods. Then you get people talking about it, and that's part of the education process. But you know, Alan has talked about this, and there are some groups. The legislature appropriated some funds last year to get UCare and different groups out and providing some information to the public. Just it is a gradual thing. I think several years ago, people weren't really talking about it as much as they are now, and not as many people are talking about it. And it's partially that the governor and the legislature is talking about it, but it's also more groups are getting involved. Like several years ago, Heal Utah wasn't really involved, and now they are, and they've got a pretty good membership base, and so they've been able to reach out to places that maybe some of the doctors groups and Moms for Clean Air groups, maybe they haven't really had that reach. And so I think things are happening. Like there's an optimistic kind of atmosphere, because people are talking about it. A lot of I think a lot more people know what Tier 3 is now than they did a year ago. Nobody knew anything about it, but now some people have, you know, some rudimentary idea about it. So I think it is just kind of keeping on to get the information out there.
Takes time to get ideas out there. Kerry, go ahead.
I guess first I'm going to just wag my finger a little bit at Shawn, and that is so there are two things that you'll hear on the air quality forecast. One is green, yellow, red. That's the current air quality today, and then there's the action. So we could have a green air quality day, but have a mandatory no burn day because they're forecasting that air quality is going to be bad by the end of the week. So it's important, and it's somewhat confusing, but it is important to understand that those are different. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I wanted to say is I think it really is a challenge to get good data out there. And I've been disappointed, I guess, on the wood burning issue on both sides, in fact, because the Utahns for Responsible Burning, who promoted the petition and were really active in a lot of the hearings, they took a graph from EPA that shows how much cleaner the various wood burnings options are than each other. However, they cropped it. So you can't see, it doesn't compare wood burning to burning natural gas or heating with oil. And if you put that in there, you would see that it's orders of magnitude dirtier to burn wood. So they've done something that doesn't give a comprehensive picture of what's going on. And I think it does promote the sort of attitude like, look, I burn and it's clean. And then there are also, there were some flyers that went out in people's utility bills that said that wood burning was responsible for 38% of particulate matter in the wintertime, and that's also not true. So I think it is important to try to keep education and good numbers out there, and I think UCARE has taken a start at this.
Good. Well, we're gearing towards the end. What I think I would do as a closing question for all of the panelists, we are in the middle of the legislative session, and we've talked quite a bit about the wood burning issue. We've talked about the federal standards on Tier 3 and also the Davis and Edwards bills that might provide a Utah twist on that. Representative Hardy was here earlier. He has two bills, one on a school bus replacement, $20 million in funding to take out the dirtiest school buses, and tax credits on alternative fuels. What other ideas out there are you excited about or not excited about from the legislative session right now and that we might see action on? Let's just go down the panel, start with you, Shawn, about active items that you have thoughts on here.
You know, there are a couple bills, like all vehicles are not created equal, and you've got some Tier 3 level vehicles on the road today that are fantastic, but there are some vehicles out there that are big polluters, and they are kind of like this wood burning issue. They are orders of magnitude worse than a partially zero emission Subaru that you might see on the road. And I know that Representative Arendt and Representative Perry each have a couple bills kind of looking at opacity, and this has more in many ways to do with diesel vehicles, but those, it's a lot of little things that I think will have an effect on this, and I'm not sure that there are any bills related to building standards, but I brought that up earlier, and I think that would be, those types of things are important to discuss. But I think the looking at diesel vehicles, and that has a lot of that direct PM 2.5, those big chunks that you actually see coming out of the exhaust pipe. But I think that if you can work on vehicles like that, if you can do something about making sure some of the worst polluters don't drive when there is a voluntary, when there's a mandatory no burn day, I think that would be fantastic.
Alan.
Well, you mentioned Representative Handy's bill to eliminate or replace the really old school buses with the cleaner versions that not only cleans the air in general, but those most exposed to the fumes are the children inside the buses. So I think there's a health impact there, and we certainly support that. There's also not very exciting bills, but some appropriation requests from DEQ that I think are really important, that would provide for some greater capacity within DAQ, an attorney general, an assistant attorney general to work on air quality issues, some staff members to go out and do more inspections on a regular basis. We've got 300 to 500 new minor sources coming on in the state each year. Those need to be inspected. So that compliance takes some money. But also couple of proposals, one for $1 million into the Kerry program, which is the Clean Air Retrofit Replacement and Off-Road Technology program. That's funding that can be used to help someone with a wood fireplace convert to natural gas. It can be used to trade out an old polluting lawnmower or snow blower for a new one, trade out an old diesel engine for a cleaner one. So I think that's going to be a really important program. The other is the Air Assist program. This is money that comes through the Department of Workforce Services to UCare, and it's a grant program to help businesses that need to comply with all these new rules that have been put in place to comply without losing jobs. So it helps them with a matching grant to meet the new standards without having to lay people off. And that's been really a successful program, and we want it to continue.
Thank you, Alan. Kerry.
Okay, well, Ellen stole every single one of my ideas, but that's okay. I wanted to mention just a couple things. So I think the school bus is a great idea especially for the children's exposure. And then on the Kerry program, one interesting thing that the Kerry program can help do is address overnight diesel idling or hoteling. So you get these long-haul diesel trucks that in order to keep the cab at a comfortable temperature at night, they'll idle. And there's been estimates that this is responsible for about 7% of the mobile source NOx emissions. So it's been estimated to be pretty significant. So it'd be nice to get a handle on that. And they have these little auxiliary power units that someone can plug into. So I think that's a nice idea that I'd like to see more of. And I also agree that there have been a lot of new rules that have been published, and these rules address businesses who have not previously been regulated. So I think funding to help them meet the standards and help them understand the rules are very useful.
It's all been brought up, but I will just reiterate our support for enhanced funding for the regulatory agencies, especially the Division of Air Quality. We think it's imperative that a well-funded, operating agency is important not only for the state, but quite honestly and selfishly, it's important for us as industry. The money that goes into research, the better the science, the better the outcome, and we're firmly committed to that philosophy. And Alan mentioned the money for a new Assistant Attorney General assigned to the Division of Air Quality. Unfortunately, in addition to the science, this has become a very litigious issue, and some of the permit applications and processes and defense of the state's actions takes months, if not years, to get through the process. And time is money for industry. And I think it's also in the benefit of the state to get things resolved quickly. So we're supportive of those things.
Wonderful. Well, we've really been able to hear a lot of perspectives, a lot of great information from our panel. Before we conclude, I just want to remind you all to take a flyer about upcoming events and visit utahbreakfast.com to learn more about our upcoming events. Share it with a friend who may be interested in the topic, if you aren't interested in the topic, and register online for our upcoming events. We also want to recognize and acknowledge the role of our sponsors, the Utah Foundation and Beehive Startups, and appreciate their efforts. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our sponsors and each of you for being here, as well as our panelists, Shawn and Alan, Kerry and Lee. Please join me in thanking them for a great discussion.